He vanished in 1944, his plane swallowed by a storm that should have ended everything. But 60 years later, that same World War II fighter was spotted flying again over the forests of Washington, its silver wings glinting in the dawn light. The pilot's family buried an empty casket decades ago. Now, they're watching the skies, wondering if he ever really died. When search teams uncover the wreckage buried deep beneath the pines, with no body inside, the past begins to unravel. A torn flight journal, a coded map, and one impossible radar reading hint that he may have crossed into something no one was meant to find. And as the propeller hums again above the trees, one question chills everyone who hears it. Who's flying that plane now? Through the morning mist that clung to the old-growth forest, the Mercer family's cabin emerged like a painting coming into focus. Rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of rain, stretched horizontal against the backdrop of towering Douglas firs. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of bacon and coffee across the damp spring air. Lieutenant Harold Mercer stood on the worn wooden porch, his crisp Army Air Forces uniform a stark contrast to the rustic setting. At 24, he cut an impressive figure, tall and straight-backed, with a quiet confidence that seemed to settle around him like his officer's cap. He adjusted the leather strap of his duffel bag, watching the sun try to break through the Olympic Peninsula's ever-present cloud cover. Inside, the scrape of chairs against wooden floorboards preceded his family's emergence. His mother, Ellen Mercer, appeared first, clutching a handkerchief she'd embroidered with his initials. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her smile remained steady, practiced in the art of brave faces that wartime mothers had perfected. "You've got your father's pocket watch?" she asked, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his uniform jacket. "And the extra socks I packed?" "Yes, ma'am," Harold replied, his voice gentle. Everything squared away. Behind her came 15-year-old June, her brown curls still untamed from sleep, wearing the oversized leather flight jacket Harold had given her last Christmas. She hadn't taken it off since he'd announced his deployment orders. Her freckled face was set in stubborn lines, fighting back emotions that threatened to spill over. "Show me the pre-flight check one more time?" June asked, her voice smaller than usual. This had become their ritual over the past months, June absorbing every detail about flying that Harold would share, as if technical knowledge could somehow keep him safe. Harold smiled, setting down his duffel. "All right, Junebug, one more time." He raised his hands, pantomiming the movements. "Fuel quantity indicators. Check both tanks," June finished, her fingers moving in mirror to his. "Landing gear position. 3 green lights for down and locked." They continued through the checklist, June reciting each step with perfect precision. Their mother watched from the doorway, knowing this was June's way of holding on to her brother for a few moments longer. The distant rumble of an approaching truck broke their concentration. Old Mr. Peterson's Ford was making its way up the logging road, right on schedule to drive Harold to McCord Field. The moment they'd all been dreading had arrived. Harold knelt down to June's eye level, his expression serious. "Keep studying those aviation manuals I left you. When I get back, I expect you to know more about planes than I do." June nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. "I will, I promise." Their mother stepped forward, pressing a small package wrapped in brown paper into Harold's hands. "For the journey," she said softly. "Your favorite molasses cookies." Harold hugged them both, holding on perhaps a moment longer than usual. The morning light had strengthened, casting long shadows through the trees. A jay called somewhere in the forest, its harsh cry echoing across the hollow. "I'll write as soon as I reach the European theater," Harold promised, shouldering his duffel bag again. "Just got this one training flight today, then processing at Fort Lewis, and I'll be shipping out." June grabbed his sleeve. "The weather looks funny," she said, glancing at the clouds gathering over the Olympic Mountains. "Maybe you should wait." Harold ruffled her hair, the gesture familiar and comforting. "Just some spring clouds, Junebug. Nothing a lightning can't handle. That P-38's the finest bird in the sky. You know that." The truck's brakes squealed as Mr. Peterson pulled up, the engine chugging roughly. "Mornin', Mercers," he called out, his weathered face solemn under his worn cap. "Time to go, Lieutenant." Harold kissed his mother's cheek, then June's forehead. "I'll see you both soon," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Keep the home fires burning." They watched him climb into the passenger seat of the old Ford, his duffel bag tucked between his feet. June ran alongside as the truck began to move, keeping pace until the rutted road curved away into the trees. Harold's hand waved from the window until the forest swallowed him from sight. The morning at McCord Field dawned cool and gray, typical for western Washington in early spring. Harold arrived at the flight line at 0700 hours, completing his paperwork with characteristic efficiency. The P-38 Lightning assigned for his training flight sat on the tarmac, its twin-boomed silhouette distinctive against the overcast sky. Tail number H-237 gleamed dully in the filtered sunlight. Weather report shows some disturbance moving in from the coast, the operations officer mentioned, stamping Harold's flight plan. Nothing serious, but keep an eye on it, Harold nodded, already running through his mental checklist. Expected duration 3 hours, standard training route over the Olympic Peninsula, radio check-ins every 30 minutes. The pre-flight inspection went smoothly. Harold ran his hands along the Lightning's aluminum skin, checking control surfaces and engine nacelles with methodical precision. This particular P-38 was an older model, somewhat worn but well-maintained. He'd flown her twice before and knew her quirks. A slight pull to port during climb-out. A temperamental radio that sometimes crackled on frequency changes. At 0745, Harold settled into the cockpit, adjusting his leather flight helmet and oxygen mask. The familiar smell of oil and metal surrounded him as he began the startup sequence. Both Allison V-1710 engines caught perfectly, their twin thrums building to a healthy roar. Through the canopy he caught sight of the ground crew chief giving him a thumbs up. The morning sun was trying to break through, creating patches of brightness among the clouds. Harold returned the gesture, then switched to the tower frequency. McCord Tower, Lightning H-237, ready for takeoff. Lightning H-237 McCord Tower. You are cleared for takeoff on runway 34. Winds light and variable, ceiling 3,000 feet. The P-38 rolled forward, building speed down the concrete runway. At precisely the right moment, Harold eased back on the yoke, and the Lightning lifted gracefully into the pearl gray sky. He made his first turn west, climbing steadily toward his assigned altitude of 12,000 feet. The first hour passed routinely. Harold maintained radio contact, reporting his position over familiar landmarks. The outskirts of Olympia, then the southern reaches of Hood Canal. The clouds were building now, creating a broken layer below him while leaving patches of visibility to the forest-covered mountains. At 0917, he made his scheduled radio check from a position near Lake Cushman. McCord Control, Lightning H-237. Position reporting point Charlie, altitude 12,000, fuel state normal. Roger, H-237, be advised, weather system intensifying to your northwest. Suggest deviation south of planned route. Harold acknowledged the warning, but the clouds ahead didn't look particularly threatening. He'd flown in far worse conditions during his training. Still, he made a slight adjustment to his heading, giving the darker clouds a wider berth. At 0945, things began to change. The cloud layer below suddenly thickened, rising up around the P-38 like walls of cotton. Harold checked his instruments, maintaining steady flight despite the deteriorating visibility. The radio crackled with increasing static. McCord Control, Lightning H-237. Request weather update for Sector Delta. Only broken fragments came back through the static. Visibility dropping. Immediate return. Unable to. The clouds pressed closer, no longer the familiar gray of normal weather, but somehow darker, more dense. The P-38's aluminum skin began to vibrate oddly, a tremor that didn't match any turbulence Harold had experienced before. His last transmission, at 0951, was clipped but clear. McCord Control, Lightning H-237, lost visual reference. Instruments. There was a pause, then, "Something's wrong with the..." The radio went silent. Back at the Mercer cabin, June sat at the kitchen table, one of Harold's aviation books open before her. She was sketching P-38 schematics, adding detailed notes about fuel systems and control surfaces, when she felt it, a sudden stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Her mother was at the sink washing breakfast dishes when the first search planes flew over, their engines shattering the unnatural quiet. They would continue searching for weeks, their paths crisscrossing the vast wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula. But they would find nothing, no wreckage, no smoke, no emergency signals, just endless trees and mountains, keeping their secrets. The P-38 Lightning, carrying Lieutenant Harold Mercer, along with its pilot, had vanished completely into the morning sky, leaving behind only questions that would echo through the decades to come. The Mercer family's kitchen calendar hung askew on the wall, its days unmarked since April 12, 1944. Sarah Mercer stood at the sink, mechanically washing the same plate she'd been holding for 10 minutes, her eyes fixed on the window where search planes droned overhead in an endless pattern. June sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by growing stacks of newspaper clippings from the Peninsula Daily News and the Seattle Times. She'd organized them chronologically, starting with the first brief mention: local pilot missing in training exercise. Each subsequent article grew shorter, pushed further back in the papers, until they became mere paragraphs tucked between war bond advertisements and ration announcements. "They're searching Sector 4 again today," June said, tracking the familiar sound of the C-47's engines. She'd learned to distinguish between the different aircraft by their sounds alone: the deep rumble of the search planes, the higher pitch of the smaller spotting aircraft. Her father, Thomas Mercer, stood in the doorway, his logger's hands raw from too many sleepless nights spent chopping wood. "Weather's clearing some. Might give them better visibility." The spring rain had been relentless, turning the Olympic Mountains into a maze of fog and low-hanging clouds. Search teams reported zero visibility above 3,000 feet, with dangerous wind conditions in the higher passes. June had mapped their search patterns on her own charts, marking off each area they'd covered, each valley they'd searched. The phone rang, startling them all. Sarah dropped the plate into the sink with a clatter, but June was already moving, reaching for the receiver with trembling fingers. "Mercer residence," she answered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Mercer?" The voice belonged to Captain Williams, their liaison officer from McCord Field. "Is your husband available?" June handed the phone to her father, pressing her ear close to hear the conversation. Her mother moved closer too, wringing her hands in her apron. "Yes, Captain. I see. Yes, I understand." Her father's voice grew thicker with each response. "Thank you for calling." The receiver clicked heavily into its cradle. Thomas Mercer looked at his wife, then his daughter, his weathered face lined with fresh grief. "They're calling off the main search," he said quietly. "Weather's too unstable, terrain's too dangerous. They'll keep a patrol aircraft on routine sweeps, but—" he swallowed hard. "The Army is preparing to classify Harold as presumed dead." Sarah Mercer made a small broken sound and sank into a kitchen chair. June stood perfectly still, her mind racing through coordinates and flight paths, searching for something they'd missed. "But they haven't found anything," she protested. "No wreckage, no sign at all. He could have—" The words stuck in her throat. Her father shook his head. "Without fuel, without supplies, in that terrain." He couldn't finish. The next weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and condolence letters. June watched her parents move through their days like ghosts, accepting casseroles from neighbors, nodding at well-meaning words of comfort. She retreated to Harold's room, spreading her maps across his bed, calculating and recalculating possible flight paths based on his last known position. The military memorial was scheduled for early May. June stood in front of her mirror, struggling with the buttons of her black dress, when her mother appeared in the doorway. "Let me help," Sarah said softly, her fingers steady as she fastened the buttons. "Harold always said these were too small for anyone to manage." The mention of his name hung in the air between them. June met her mother's eyes in the mirror, seeing her own grief reflected there. "I'm not giving up," June whispered. "Even if they stop looking." Sarah's hands stilled on June's shoulders. "I know, sweetheart. I know." The cemetery in Forks was small, tucked between ancient cedars that had stood watch over the town for centuries. The empty casket gleamed dully under the overcast sky, its polished surface reflecting the dress uniforms of the honor guard. Captain Williams delivered the eulogy, speaking of duty and sacrifice, of a young pilot's dedication to his country. June barely heard the words. She was focused on the casket, knowing it contained nothing but air. No body, no proof, no answers. The honor guard raised their rifles. The sharp crack of the 21-gun salute echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering into the gray sky. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes drifting across the cemetery. As the crowd began to disperse, June stepped forward. She'd written the note that morning, her words careful and deliberate on the small piece of paper. While her parents spoke with the chaplain, she slipped it through the casket's seal. "Come home when you can." The words were both a prayer and a promise. June stepped back as the cemetery workers began lowering the empty casket into the ground. Above them, through a break in the clouds, a lone search plane made its final pass over the mountains. That evening, June added another clipping to her collection. Lieutenant Harold Mercer laid to rest, local pilot honored in military service. She pinned it carefully to her growing wall of maps and articles, then opened Harold's dog-eared copy of Basic Flight Mechanics. The search planes might stop flying, but she wouldn't stop looking. Somewhere in those mountains, in the spaces between what was known and what was possible, her brother's story was waiting to be found. In her new black dress, still stiff with grief and store creases, June sat at her desk and began to read, determined to understand everything about the aircraft that had carried her brother into the clouds. The evening light faded around her, but she kept reading, turning pages, while somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Olympic Mountains like the echo of engines long silent. The summer heat settled over the Olympic Peninsula like a heavy blanket, but deep in the forest, an unseasonal chill lingered. Frank Morrison, who'd worked as a park ranger for 23 years, felt it during his morning patrols, a strange coolness that didn't match the August temperatures. He stood at the edge of the Palmer Creek Trail, frowning at a massive Douglas fir that had somehow split cleanly down its middle during the night. The cut was too precise, too unnatural. No lightning strike could do this. The edges were sharp, almost mechanical. Like something swooped right through it, he muttered, running his calloused hand along the smooth surface of the break. Other trees nearby showed similar damage, all at the same height, all pointing in the same direction. The sound came again. That distant thrumming he'd been hearing for weeks now. Like airplane engines, but different somehow. Deeper. When he reported it to his supervisor, they blamed summer tourism, military training flights, or his imagination. But Morrison knew every sound these woods could make, and this one didn't belong. That morning, as the mist rolled down from the mountains, he saw it, just for a moment, a flash of silver, too high to be a regular aircraft, moving in ways that defied everything he knew about flight. When he filed his report, they suggested he take some vacation time. At McCord Field, June Mercer had become a familiar sight. Every Saturday morning, she'd arrive with her leather satchel full of maps and newspaper clippings, positioning herself near the pilot's mess hall. At first, they avoided her. The missing pilot's sister, her grief too raw to face, but June's quiet persistence wore down their defenses. "Your brother was one of the best," Lieutenant Cooper told her one morning, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Natural talent. Could read the sky like nobody else." He paused, glancing over his shoulder before adding, "They picked him special for those high-altitude runs." "What high-altitude runs?" June asked. But Cooper was already walking away, crushing his half-smoked cigarette under his boot. She collected these fragments of information like precious stones. Captain Rodriguez mentioned training missions that weren't in the official logs. Sergeant Wells spoke of strange equipment being installed in certain P-38s, then quickly changed the subject. Each conversation ended the same way, with nervous glances and hurried departures. The airfield's administrative office became her second home. Miss Pearson, the clerk, took pity on June and allowed her to review maintenance records and flight logs. "Just don't mess up my filing system," she warned, but her eyes were kind. June spent hours cross-referencing dates and times, noting discrepancies. Harold's squadron had been running regular training flights, but there were gaps, whole days where their aircraft were logged out but with no corresponding mission reports. "Miss Pearson," June called one afternoon, "do you have the weather reports for April 1944? The clerk shuffled through her files. "Should be in with the monthly summaries. Though we had some filing issues that spring, a lot of papers got mixed up during the reorganization." June nodded, but something in Miss Pearson's tone made her look up. The older woman was studying her desk calendar with unusual intensity. That night, June spread her growing collection of documents across her bedroom floor. Harold's official file lay open before her, and now that she knew what to look for, the gaps were obvious. Pages had been removed, leaving behind slight impressions where paper clips had once held them together. The remaining pages jumped from April 10th to April 15th, with Harold's disappearance on the 12th conspicuously absent. In town, the stories kept coming. Old Man Jenkins, who lived on the western edge of Forks, reported hearing propeller sounds at 3 in the morning. Like one of them fighter planes, but funny sounding. The next day, his prized apple tree was found split in half, the break so clean it looked machined. A group of loggers reported similar damage 10 miles into the forest, a straight line of trees all damaged the same way, all at the same height. The logging company blamed wind shear, but June had never heard of wind that could cut wood like a razor. She began mapping the incidents, pushing pins into a large Forest Service map tacked to her wall. The pattern that emerged made no sense. The damaged sites formed perfect concentric circles centered on a point deep in the Olympic range where no plane should have been able to fly. The summer grew hotter, but the strange cold spots in the forest persisted. Rangers reported patches of frost in August, always near the damaged trees. June hiked to one of these sites herself, feeling the temperature drop 10 degrees as she approached the split trunks. At the airfield, she finally caught a break. Technical Sergeant James Murphy, newly transferred from California, didn't know enough to avoid her. Over coffee in the mess hall, he spoke freely about the specialized equipment he'd helped install in certain P-38s that spring. "Strange stuff," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Never seen anything like it. All these extra antennae and measuring devices. The brass called it atmospheric research, but..." He shrugged. "Way above my pay grade." "Did my brother's plane have this equipment?" June asked. Murphy's face changed. "I shouldn't be talking about this." He stood abruptly, coffee forgotten. "I'm sorry about your brother, Miss Mercer, but you should let it go. Some questions. They don't lead anywhere good." That afternoon, June returned to the Yalo administrative office, determined to find any record of these modifications. Miss Pearson was out to lunch, and the filing cabinet stood unguarded. June hesitated only a moment before slipping behind the desk. Harold's personnel file was thin now, stripped of whatever secrets it had once held. But as she flipped through the remaining pages, a small note fell out, a maintenance requisition in Harold's handwriting, dated April 11, 1944. The details were mostly technical, but one line stood out. Anomalous compass readings during test of new equipment. Magnetic interference. Advise. The rest of the page had been torn away. June was so absorbed in the document that she didn't hear the door open. A hand fell on her shoulder and she turned to find Colonel Matthews, the base commander, standing behind her. "Miss Mercer," he said quietly, "I think it's time we had a talk about your unauthorized access to military records." She clutched the requisition form tighter, but the colonel gently pried it from her fingers. "Your brother was a fine pilot and a good man. Don't tarnish his memory by chasing shadows." "But the missing pages," June started. "Standard procedure for classified missions," Matthews cut her off. "Nothing unusual. Now, I'm not going to press charges, but you can't come back here. Do you understand?" June looked at the colonel's face, not unkind but absolutely unyielding. She thought of all the other faces she'd seen over the summer, the way they'd turn away when certain subjects came up, the fear hidden behind their silence. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand perfectly." That evening, as June added the torn requisition form to her wall of evidence, another tree split in the Olympic forest. Frank Morrison, working a late patrol, heard the sound, not a crack or a crash, but a clean whisper, like a blade through silk. By the time he reached the site, there was nothing to see but the perfect cut and, high above, a patch of sky where the stars seemed to shift in ways they shouldn't. Spring blossoms gave way to summer heat, then autumn chill, and finally winter snow before the telegram arrived. Germany had surrendered. In Forks, Washington, celebrations broke out along the main street, but at the Mercer household, victory felt hollow. Martha Mercer stood at her kitchen window, watching the neighbor boys return home one by one. Each reunion she witnessed carved deeper lines around her eyes. She'd taken to covering all the mirrors in the house. She couldn't bear to see Harold's features reflected in her own face anymore. June, now 16, sat at the kitchen table surrounded by her growing collection of maps and documents. She'd developed a system, marking each strange occurrence in the forest with different colored pins. Red for unexplained sounds, blue for equipment malfunctions, yellow for visual anomalies. The pattern spread across the Olympic Peninsula like a constellation. "We should pack these away," her father said one evening, gesturing at the maps. William Mercer had aged a decade in the past year, his logger's hands now trembling when he lifted his coffee cup. "The realtor's coming tomorrow." June's head snapped up. "What realtor?" "Your mother and I." He cleared his throat. "We've decided to sell. Your uncle has work for me at his mill in Spokane." "We can't leave," June protested, her voice rising. "Harold's here." "The forest." "Harold's gone, June bug." Her father's voice cracked. "The forest didn't give him back, and it's not going to." But June knew different. Just last week, she'd hiked out to Pyramid Peak with her friend Sarah, whose father worked as an air traffic controller at McCord. Sarah had smuggled out a copy of the radar readings from April 12, 1944, the day Harold vanished. June unfolded the paper now, spreading it on the kitchen table. The tracking line showed Harold's P-38 following its expected course until 2:47 p.m. Then something impossible happened. Instead of the downward plunge they'd all assumed, the radar showed a sudden vertical climb, straight up, rising at speeds that should have torn any aircraft apart. The reading ended in a single spike that went off the chart's upper limit. "Look," June insisted, pushing the paper toward her father. "This doesn't make sense. A crash would show descent, not—" "Enough!" William slammed his palm on the table, making the coffee cups rattle. He'd never raised his voice to June before. "I won't have any more of this. This obsession." The Army explained it: radar malfunction. Equipment wasn't as reliable back then. But June had also seen the letter from the radar manufacturer dated 3 days after Harold's disappearance, certifying that all equipment was functioning normally. The next morning, June woke to the sound of cardboard boxes being assembled. Through her window, she watched her mother methodically removing Harold's model planes from their shelf in the front room. Each one was carefully wrapped in newspaper, his childhood dreams packed away like fragile glass. At the airfield, June made one last attempt to understand. She'd befriended Jerry Whitman, an older pilot who'd flown search missions after Harold disappeared. They met in his small office where maps of the Olympic Peninsula covered one wall. "The thing that always bothered me," Jerry said, studying the radar printout, "was the weather. Report said storm conditions, but I flew that morning. Sky was clear until noon." He tapped the paper where the vertical line began. "Then those clouds rolled in fast, never seen anything like it. Formed a perfect column right where your brother's signal vanished." "The Army says it was a malfunction," June replied, watching his reaction. Jerry snorted. "Army says a lot of things. Week after it happened, some fellows in plain suits came through. Collected all the original weather data, radio logs, everything. Said it was classified." He leaned back, eyes distant. "You know what's funny? Next day, they installed new radar equipment. Top-of-the-line stuff, like they were looking for something specific." June added this to her mental catalog of inconsistencies: the missing files, the modified planes, the strange equipment. She thought of Harold's last known words over the radio. "Surface contact at Angels 20. Something's—" Then static. The realtor came on a Tuesday. June listened from her room as he praised the property's location, the solid construction, the views of the mountains that had swallowed her brother. Her mother's voice drifted up, discussing prices and paperwork. That night, June slipped out her window. The forest beckoned, dark and deep, its secrets still buried beneath layers of pine needles and silence. She hiked until she reached Harold's favorite spot, a clearing where the Olympics stretched out like waves of green stone against the sky. The trees whispered their ancient songs, but they felt different now. Wrong. June had spent hundreds of hours in these woods since Harold vanished, searching for something. A sign. A clue. Instead, she'd found only questions that grew darker with each passing month. She thought about Jerry's description of the clouds that day, a vertical column, like a corridor into the sky. She remembered the loggers' reports of trees sliced clean through, the compass anomalies, the cold spots that persisted through summer heat. "What really happened to you?" she whispered to the darkness. The forest kept its counsel, but June knew now that Harold's disappearance wasn't just another wartime tragedy. Something else had occurred that April day, something the Army wanted to hide. The evidence was there in that final radar spike, in the missing files, in the strange modifications to his plane. The for sale sign went up on a Wednesday. By Friday, they had an offer. June watched her mother sign the papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a betrayal. They would leave before Christmas, they decided. New year, new start. That evening, June carefully copied every map, every document, every scrap of information she'd gathered. The originals would go into storage, but these copies would travel with her to Spokane. She wasn't leaving this mystery behind. She was just changing her vantage point. As she worked, the radio crackled with news of Japan's surrender. World War II was officially over. Soldiers would return home, families would reunite, and life would gradually return to normal. But June knew there would be no normal for her family, not while Harold's true fate remained hidden behind classified stamps and government silence. The last box was packed on December 20th. June stood in her empty room, touching the marks on the wall where her evidence board had hung. Tomorrow they would drive east, leaving behind the Olympic forests and their secrets. But June understood something now that her parents didn't. Harold's disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Whatever had reached down from those strange clouds and snatched her brother's plane from the sky was still out there. The Army's silence proved it. The missing files confirmed it. They weren't just covering up a crash. They were hiding something much bigger. That night, before leaving town for good, June made one final visit to the cemetery. Harold's empty grave stood silent under a blanket of fresh snow. She placed her hand on the cold stone, feeling the wrongness of it. This marker memorialized a crash that never happened, a body that was never found. "I'll find the truth," she whispered to the winter air. "I promise." Above her, the clouds parted briefly, revealing a strip of star-filled sky. June stared up at that dark expanse, remembering the radar's final reading, not down into the mountains, but up into the endless black. Something had taken Harold that day, something the government wanted to keep secret, and June Mercer intended to discover exactly what it was. June's fingers traced the dust-covered spines in Western Washington University's library, the history section becoming her second home during long nights of research. Fall 1950 painted the campus in amber and rust, but she barely noticed the seasons changing anymore. Her focus remained fixed on the past, specifically on April 12, 1944. "Miss Mercer," Professor Andrews' voice carried across the empty reading room. "Still here? It's nearly midnight." June looked up from the stack of old newspapers, her eyes tired from squinting at microfilm readers. At 21, she carried herself with the weighted purpose of someone much older. Her brown hair, once wild like Harold's, stayed neatly pinned back now. The freckles remained, though, a stubborn reminder of summers spent searching the Olympic forests with her brother. "Just finishing up, Professor," she said, gathering her notes. 6 years of investigation had taught her to be careful about sharing too much. People got uncomfortable when she mentioned Harold, their eyes taking on that pitying look she'd grown to hate. The professor paused at her table, glancing at her research. "World War II Pacific Theater operations? I thought your thesis was on home front industrial mobilization." "It is." June slid the newspapers into her bag. "This is personal research." Andrews nodded, understanding crossing his features. Everyone in the history department knew about June's brother. It was why they'd been so supportive when she changed her major from engineering to military history. They thought it was her way of processing grief. They didn't know about the box under her bed filled with weather reports, radar logs, and witness statements, or the wall in her apartment covered with maps of the Olympic Peninsula, red strings connecting unexplained incidents spanning decades. Back in her small off-campus apartment, June added today's findings to her collection. A paragraph in a 1944 Port Angeles newspaper mentioned unusual magnetic disturbances reported by ships in the Strait of Juan de Fuca the week Harold disappeared. The military had dismissed it as equipment malfunction, just like they'd dismissed the radar anomalies. A letter from home waited on her desk. June recognized her mother's handwriting, the careful script that had grown shakier over the years. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. The same message came every few months. "Please stop looking, let him rest." But how could she rest when nothing made sense? The official story crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. Harold's flight plan that day showed him heading northwest, but witnesses reported seeing his P-38 flying east. The weather station recorded clear skies until the moment of his disappearance, when a localized storm appeared out of nowhere. And then there were the other pilots. 3 more had vanished in the same area between 1943 and 1944, all during classified training flights. June pinned the newspaper clipping to her wall. Her parents didn't understand. They'd chosen to accept the Army's explanation, to bury their questions along with that empty casket. But June couldn't forget the look in Harold's eyes that last morning. Not fear, but something else. Recognition, maybe, like he'd seen something up there in the clouds that he couldn't explain. The years slipped by. June graduated with honors, her thesis on wartime industrial production earning praise. But her real work continued in private. She took a job at the Washington State Historical Society, using her position to access military records and interview veterans. Most doors closed in her face, some open just enough to reveal more questions. In 1955, her mother's health began failing. June made regular trips back to Spokane, watching her parents age under the weight of unresolved loss. They'd removed all photos of Harold from their walls, as if erasing him might ease the pain. But June saw how her father's hands shook when planes flew overhead, how her mother still set an extra place at holiday dinners before catching herself. "You have to stop," her father pleaded during one visit. "This obsession, it's not healthy. Harold's gone. No amount of digging will bring him back." June wanted to show him the patterns she'd discovered. The electromagnetic anomalies, the missing records, the witnesses silenced by official denials. But she'd learned to keep her theories to herself. The truth was, she'd found something bigger than Harold's disappearance. A pattern of secrecy that suggested the military knew exactly what happened that day. By 1958, June had built a reputation as a meticulous military historian. Her published works on Pacific theater logistics earned her access to restricted archives. In October, she received permission to visit the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Montgomery, Alabama. The archive building sat like a fortress of concrete and steel, its corridors maze-like and climate-controlled. June presented her credentials to the archivist, a thin man named Phillips who seemed suspicious of her specific request. "Aircraft loss records, 1943 to 1944, Olympic Peninsula region," she explained, keeping her voice professionally detached. "I'm researching training accident patterns for a paper on pilot safety protocols." Phillips disappeared into the stacks, returning with a thick folder. "Sign here," he said, sliding a log sheet across the desk. "These records don't leave the reading room." June's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. 14 years of searching had led to this moment. She began methodically examining each document, looking for Harold's tail number, H237. The morning stretched into afternoon. Her eyes burned from strain, but she kept reading. Finally, on page 347, she found it. A list of training losses from April 1944. Her heart stopped. Where Harold's tail number should have been, there was only a black line of redaction ink. The entire entry had been censored, marked with a stamp. Classified. Executive Order 1N501. June stared at that black line until it burned into her vision. She'd expected answers, but this was something else. Proof that Harold's disappearance wasn't just another wartime tragedy. Someone had deliberately hidden the truth. "Find what you were looking for?" Phillips asked as she returned the folder. "No," June replied quietly, "but I found something." That night, in her hotel room, June spread out 14 years of research on the bed. The redacted entry wasn't an end. It was confirmation that she'd been right all along. Harold hadn't simply crashed. Something had happened over the Olympic Peninsula in 1944, something the military was still hiding. She thought of her parents back in Spokane, of their plea to let the past rest. But June knew now that she couldn't stop. The truth was out there, buried under layers of government secrecy. Harold's disappearance was part of something larger, something that left behind only shadows on radar screens and black lines in official documents. The next morning, June boarded her flight home, a new determination settling into her bones. They could redact documents and classify files, but they couldn't erase the evidence she'd already gathered. Somewhere in her collection of weather anomalies, magnetic disturbances, and witness accounts lay the key to understanding what really happened that spring day in 1944. Her brother's final flight had vanished into mystery, but June Mercer was just getting started. Walter Griggs adjusted his camp chair, watching his 12-year-old grandson Cody poke at the dying campfire with a stick. The October evening had brought an early chill to Lake Crescent, and wisps of mist crept between the towering Douglas firs surrounding their campsite. "Grandpa, tell me about the weird stuff you saw when you were a ranger," Cody said, not looking up from the embers. Walter smiled, pulling his fleece jacket tighter. After 32 years patrolling Olympic National Park, he had plenty of stories, but some he kept to himself, the unexplainable things he'd witnessed in these ancient forests. "Maybe tomorrow, bud. It's getting late and we've got an early hike planned." The boy groaned but didn't argue. Walter checked his watch, 8:47 p.m. The nearly full moon cast silver patches through breaks in the canopy, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. A low rumble made Walter sit up straighter. "You hear that?" Cody nodded, dropping his stick. "Sounds like an airplane?" But it wasn't quite right. Walter had heard every type of aircraft during his years in the park. Commercial jets, Coast Guard helicopters, private planes. This was different, deeper, older. The sound grew louder, and Walter felt it in his chest. the distinctive throb of piston engines. He stood scanning the treetops. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the mountains that cupped Lake Crescent. There. Cody pointed toward the lake. Through a gap in the trees, Walter saw it, a flash of polished aluminum, sleek twin booms, that unmistakable profile he knew from countless World War II documentaries. A P-38 Lightning fighter plane. It was flying impossibly low, just above the tree line, and completely silent now despite its nearness. "Quick, your phone!" Walter grabbed Cody's shoulder. The boy fumbled with his pocket, pulling out his flip phone. The P-38 banked gracefully between two massive firs, moonlight gleaming off its fuselage. Walter caught glimpses through the branches, the bubble canopy, the distinctive twin-tail assembly, numbers painted on the side. The aircraft moved with an almost liquid grace, too smooth for something so massive. Cody held up his phone, trying to track the plane through the small screen. "It's too dark!" "Just keep recording," Walter urged, his heart pounding. He'd seen strange things in these woods, but nothing like this. The P-38 made another pass, closer this time, and Walter could clearly see the tail number, H237. As suddenly as it had appeared, the aircraft vanished behind the ridge. The sound of its engines returned briefly, fading into the distance until only the night sounds of the forest remained. Cody lowered his phone, hands shaking slightly. Was that real? Walter stared at the space where the P-38 had been, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "Must be some kind of air show practice," he said, more to convince himself than his grandson. "Though I didn't hear about any events planned." They played back the video on Cody's phone. The quality was poor in the low light, but you could make out the distinctive shape cutting through the trees, the flash of silver, the tail number visible in one frame. "We should report it," Cody said. "Flying that low has to be illegal, right?" Walter nodded slowly. First thing tomorrow he'd make some calls. After 3 decades of service, he knew every park ranger and local law enforcement officer in the area. Someone would want to know about this. The next morning, Walter drove them into Port Angeles, where the Park Service maintained its main Olympic Peninsula office. Sarah Martinez, the chief ranger, was an old colleague who'd started as a seasonal employee under Walter's supervision 15 years ago. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. "You saw a World War II fighter plane buzzing Lake Crescent last night? In the dark?" "I know how it sounds," Walter replied. He'd insisted Cody wait in the lobby, not wanting the boy to see his grandfather dismissed as a crackpot. "But we got video, not great quality, but enough to see the plane and its numbers." Sarah's expression softened. She'd known Walter long enough to trust his judgment. "Okay, show me." They watched the shaky footage together. Sarah froze on the clearest frame, squinting at the tail number. "H237, she read. "I'll check with the FAA, see if anyone registered a flight plan for a restored P-38. There are still some flying, but not many, and none should be operating in the park at night." By that afternoon, the story had spread through local law enforcement channels. The FAA confirmed no P-38s were registered for flights in the area. The closest airworthy Lightning was in a museum in Oregon, and it hadn't left the ground in months. The Port Angeles Evening News ran a small article about the sighting. That's where June Mercer first saw it, in her morning paper delivery in Seattle. She was having her usual breakfast, black coffee and dry toast, when the small headline caught her eye. WW2 fighter plane spotted over Lake Crescent. June had tracked hundreds of alleged wartime aircraft sightings over the decades, most turning out to be misidentified private planes or publicity stunts. But when she read the tail number, her coffee cup slipped from suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. H237. Harold's plane. June's hands trembled as she read the article again. The ranger's description matched perfectly. The altitude, the silent passage, even the way it seemed to glide more than fly. She'd heard similar accounts from witnesses in '44, before the military warned them to keep quiet. Within an hour, she had packed a small overnight bag and called her neighbor to feed her cat. The drive from Seattle to Port Angeles took just under 3 hours, but June barely noticed the familiar Olympic Peninsula landscape rolling past her window. Her mind was 60 years away, replaying that spring morning when Harold kissed her goodbye. At the ranger station, Sarah Martinez was surprised to find an elderly woman waiting when she returned from lunch. Despite her age, June Mercer stood straight-backed and alert, a worn leather satchel clutched in her hands. "I need to speak with Walter Griggs," June said without preamble, "about the P-38. Sarah started to explain that they weren't discussing the incident until the FAA completed its inquiry, but something in June's expression made her pause. "May I ask why?" June opened her satchel and removed a yellowed photograph. It showed a young pilot standing proudly next to a P-38 Lightning. The tail number was clearly visible, H237. "Because," June said quietly, "that was my brother's plane, and I've been looking for it since 1944. Within the hour, Walter Griggs arrived back at the station. He'd been about to head home to Seattle with Cody, but turned around as soon as Sarah called. Something in her voice told him this was important. June looked small in the station's plastic chair, but her eyes were sharp as she studied Walter's face. He noticed her hands never left the leather satchel in her lap. "I saw your video," she said after introductions. "Could you describe exactly what you witnessed?" Walter recounted the experience, adding details he hadn't included in his official report. The way the engine sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, how the plane moved too smoothly for its size, the strange quality of the moonlight on its wings. June nodded at each detail, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When Walter finished, she opened her satchel and began laying out documents on Sarah's desk. Photographs, weather reports, radar logs, all meticulously organized. "In April 1944, my brother Harold disappeared during a training flight over the Olympic Peninsula," June explained. "His P-38 Lightning was never found. The military declared him killed in action, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were inconsistencies, things that didn't add up." She pointed to a radar log. "Like this, the last reading shows his plane climbing at an impossible rate before vanishing. And here," she indicated a weather report. "The localized storm that supposedly brought him down appeared out of nowhere, defying all meteorological patterns." Walter leaned forward, studying the documents. "And the tail number matches." "Exactly." June's voice held 60 years of certainty. H237, Harold's plane. By evening, the story had reached Seattle news stations. Amateur aviation enthusiasts and military history buffs began calling the ranger station. Someone posted Cody's video online, and despite its poor quality, experts confirmed the aircraft was indeed a P-38 Lightning. June sat in her hotel room that night, spreading her research across the bed just as she had countless times before. But now she had something new, proof that others had seen it too. The ranger's account matched too perfectly to be coincidence. Her phone kept ringing. Reporters, investigators, even a few military officials claiming to be interested in the historical significance of the sighting. June answered none of them. She'd learned long ago that the truth about Harold's disappearance wouldn't come from official channels. Tomorrow, she would visit Lake Crescent with Walter. He'd offered to show her exactly where the P-38 had passed through the trees. For the first time in decades, June felt close to answers. She pulled out Harold's last letter, read 2 weeks after his disappearance. The paper had grown delicate with age, but she knew every word by heart. "Something strange up here, Junebug. The clouds don't move right. Yesterday, Thompson swears he saw the same mountain peak twice during one pass. They tell us it's altitude sickness, but I know what I see. If anything happens, don't let them feed you their excuses. Keep looking up." June folded the letter carefully and returned it to her satchel. Outside her window, the Olympic Mountains loomed black against the stars, still keeping their secrets after all these years. But maybe, just maybe, they were finally ready to share them. The LiDAR equipment hummed softly in the back of Dr. Caleb Vance's SUV as they wound their way up the unmarked Forest Service road. June sat in the passenger seat, her leather satchel balanced on her lap, watching the dense forest scroll past. 2 weeks of mounting anticipation had led to this moment. "The anomaly showed up clear as day," Vance explained, tapping the laptop mounted on his dashboard. "A perfect geometric shape under 30 feet of vegetation. Too regular to be natural." Behind them, 2 more vehicles carried the rest of the search team, professional excavators, aviation archaeologists, and Park Service representatives. They'd assembled quickly after the initial scans revealed something promising in a remote valley 15 miles east of Lake Crescent. June studied the topographical display, noting how the terrain matched Harold's old flight paths. "Here," she pointed to a shadowed depression. "This matches the radar track from 44. He was following the valley floor when contact was lost." The convoy stopped at an old logging turnout. Morning mist still clung to the towering Douglas firs, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. June watched the team unload their equipment with practiced efficiency. ground-penetrating radar units, survey tools, cameras, and carefully packed excavation gear. "Mrs. Mercer," called Sarah Martinez, now serving as their National Park Service liaison. "We've got your gear ready." She handed June a safety vest and hard hat, both marked with "Observer" in bold letters. The hike to the site took nearly 2 hours. June insisted on walking despite offers to wait at base camp. Her sensible boots handled the rough terrain well enough, though she occasionally needed to rest. Each time she stopped, she pulled out Harold's old maps, comparing landmarks to modern GPS readings. "Wait," she called out, pointing to a distinctive rock formation. "That's in his sketches. Devil's Thumb, he called it. We're on his route." The LiDAR team set up their equipment in a small clearing. High-resolution scans began painting a clearer picture of what lay beneath the thick undergrowth. June watched the screens intently as ghostly shapes emerged from the data. "There," Vance said suddenly, enhancing one section. "That's no natural formation." The image showed a distinctive twin-boom silhouette, the unmistakable shape of a P-38 Lightning, nose down at a slight angle. The team quickly marked out a grid pattern, and the excavation began. It took 3 days of careful digging before they reached the first piece of metal. June was there when the brush clearing team exposed a patch of weathered aluminum skin, still bearing traces of olive drab paint. She touched it with trembling fingers, feeling the cold reality of what they'd found. "The preservation is remarkable," Vance noted, photographing every newly exposed section. The soil composition and constant moisture created almost perfect conditions. By the end of the week, they had uncovered most of the aircraft's tail section. The numbers emerged slowly as they cleaned decades of dirt from the surface. H-237. June sat down hard on a nearby stump when she saw them, her hands pressed to her mouth. "It's him," she whispered. "It's Harold's plane." The excavation proceeded with increased care. Aviation historians and military representatives arrived to document every detail. The aircraft's condition defied explanation. While some sections showed severe deterioration, others appeared almost factory fresh. The inconsistent aging pattern puzzled the experts. "These parts look like they've been here 70 years, one specialist muttered, examining the port wing. "But these others, 30 years of exposure at most, it doesn't make sense." On the 10th day they reached the cockpit. June insisted on being present as they carefully cleared the canopy, which had shattered but remained largely intact. The morning sun broke through the forest canopy as they worked, casting dappled light across the exposed metal. The first surprise was the jacket. It lay folded neatly on the pilot's seat, preserved by the relatively dry cockpit environment. June recognized it immediately. Harold's A2 leather flight jacket, the one he'd worn every mission. The name tag was still legible. Lieutenant H. Mercer. Why would he take it off? Sarah wondered aloud. These planes got cold at altitude. June ran her fingers over the worn leather. He never flew without it. Said it was his lucky charm. The second discovery came as they examined the instrument panel. Wedged behind the dashboard, protected from the worst of the elements, they found a waterlogged journal. The leather cover was Harold's. June recognized the distinctive scratch he'd put there during training. They carefully extracted it, placing it in a preservation container. Many pages had fused together, but the last few entries remained partially readable. June held her breath as the conservation specialist carefully separated the final page. The handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, but the ink had bled and faded. Most lines were illegible, but the last entry stood out clearly, written with pressing urgency. "They're not clouds, they watch." June read the words again and again, feeling the weight of their implications. She remembered his last letter, the strange reports from other pilots, the decades of unexplained sightings. The most troubling question remained: where was Harold? The cockpit contained no human remains, no personal effects besides the jacket and journal. The seat straps were unbuckled, not torn, suggesting a deliberate exit, but the area had been searched extensively in 1944. How had they missed a crash site this intact? "Dr. Vance," called one of the technicians, "you need to see these readings." The scientist studied a tablet displaying new scan data. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Run it again." June moved closer. "What is it?" "The metal composition analysis," Vance explained. "Parts of this aircraft show trace elements that, well, they don't match any known aluminum alloy. Not from the 1940s, not from now." The military observers exchanged glances. One made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones. By afternoon, more officials had arrived. They began restricting access to the site, setting up a wider perimeter. June refused to leave, her presence protected by Sarah's Park Service Authority and decades of legal documentation of her connection to the case. As the sun set, June sat alone by the partially excavated aircraft. She opened her satchel, pulling out the photo she'd carried for 60 years. Harold standing proudly beside this very plane. She held it up, comparing details. Every panel line matched, every rivet pattern identical. "What happened to you?" she whispered, touching the cold metal. "Where did you go?" The forest grew darker, but June remained, watching shadows creep across the lightning's weather-worn skin. Somewhere above, clouds drifted past the treetops. Ordinary clouds, she told herself, just water vapor and air. But as night fell completely, she couldn't shake the feeling that something up there was watching back. Sarah approached with a flashlight. "Mrs. Mercer, we need to secure the site for the night." June nodded, gathering her belongings. She took one last look at the cockpit where her brother had last sat, the empty seat holding decades of questions. The folded jacket seemed to wait for its owner's return, the journal's final warning echoing in her mind. They had found Harold's plane, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. Where was her brother? What had he seen in those strange clouds? And why, after 60 years, had his aircraft finally allowed itself to be found? The answers, June suspected, lay somewhere in those weathered pages, and in the impossible metal that didn't belong in any earthly aircraft factory. The fluorescent lights of the Seattle Forensic Aviation Laboratory hummed overhead as June watched Dr. Caleb Vance methodically examine pieces of the recovered P-38. His wool vest was spotted with dust, and his perpetually furrowed brow deepened as he compared serial numbers under a magnifying glass. "The main fuselage, numbers match Army Air Force records," he said, adjusting his rimless glasses. "Cross-referenced against 3 separate databases. This is definitely Lightning H-237, assigned to Lieutenant Harold Mercer in March 1944. June sat stiffly in a wheeled office chair, her leather satchel clutched in her lap. The lab smelled of metal and cleaning solutions, with underlying notes of coffee from Vance's ever-present thermos. "But," she prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. Vance straightened, his tall frame slightly stooped from years of examining wreckage. "But the physical evidence doesn't align with a 60-year-old crash site. Look here." He gestured to a section of wing structure laid out on the examination table. June rolled her chair closer, leaning in to see where he pointed. "This aluminum shows maybe 30 years of corrosion, maximum. Yet this section here," he moved to another piece, "has degraded far more extensively. It's as if different parts of the same aircraft aged at different rates." "Could the soil conditions explain it?" June asked, though she already suspected the answer. Vance shook his head. "We've analyzed soil samples from the entire site. Consistent pH levels, moisture content, mineral composition. Nothing that would cause this kind of selective degradation." He pulled up digital images on a nearby monitor, showing microscopic analysis of the metal surfaces. "Furthermore, the impact patterns don't match a crash. The nose was buried, yes, but there's no compression damage, no signs of violent contact with the ground." "You're saying it landed?" June's voice was barely above a whisper. "Deliberately, someone set that plane down with considerable skill." Vance paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Mrs. Mercer, in all my years studying aircraft recovery, I've never seen anything quite like this." June opened her satchel, removing a folder of documents she'd been organizing since the discovery. "There's more," she said, spreading photographs across an empty workbench. "These are from the original search in '44. The area where we found the plane, they covered it thoroughly. Multiple ground teams, aerial surveys. There's no way they missed a nearly intact P-38. Vance studied the search grid maps, his coffee forgotten. "The vegetation patterns support your point. Those trees around the site? Many predate 1944. The plane couldn't have crashed through them. They were never broken or damaged." "So either every search team in 1944 was blind," June said, or the plane wasn't there to find," Vance finished quietly. They were interrupted by Sarah Martinez, the Park Service liaison, hurrying into the lab. She carried a manila envelope, unsealed and crumpled as if opened in haste. "Mrs. Mercer, this just arrived for you at the park office." She handed over the envelope, catching her breath. No return address, but it's marked with military archive codes. June emptied the envelope onto the workbench. A single sheet of yellowed paper slid out. A weather report dated April 17, 1944. The day Harold disappeared. Vance leaned in, scanning the document. His eyes widened behind his glasses. This is an official Army Air Force's meteorological record. But that can't be right. June's hands trembled as she read. The report showed clear conditions over the Olympic Peninsula that morning. High visibility, light winds, no storm activity within 100 miles. All these years, she said, her voice tight. They told us he went down in bad weather. That's why they called off the search so quickly. Poor conditions, they said. This document's authentic, Vance confirmed, examining the letterhead and stamps. These classification markings match the period. Someone pulled this from a restricted archive. June sank back into her chair, 60 years of accepted truth crumbling. If there was no storm, what made him vanish from radar? Why did they lie? Vance carefully laid out the pieces they'd gathered. The inconsistent aging of the wreckage, the pristine landing site undiscovered for decades, and now a weather report contradicting the official story. The military observers at the site, he said thoughtfully. They seemed unsurprised by the anomalies, almost like they expected them. They've taken control of the whole area now, Sarah added. Restricted access, new security. They're calling it an aviation heritage preservation effort, but... June pulled out Harold's recovered journal, still in its protective sleeve. Most pages remained unreadable, but those final words stood clear. They're not clouds, they watch. Dr. Vance, she said, fixing him with a steady gaze. What exactly are we dealing with here? The scientist ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Mercer, I'm a forensic archaeologist. I deal in physical evidence, verifiable facts. But this... He gestured at their accumulated findings. The facts aren't adding up to any reasonable explanation. June began methodically repacking her satchel. Then we need more facts. The Army Air Forces kept detailed records of every training flight. There must be more documentation about Harold's mission that day. Most files from that period are still classified, Sarah pointed out. Someone got us this weather report, June countered. Someone wants the truth known. Vance nodded slowly. I have contacts in the military archives, people who owe me favors. I can make some inquiries. And I'll keep working on the journal, June said. There are preservation techniques that might help reveal more text. She stood, leaning on the workbench for support. At 76, her body might be slowing down, but her mind was sharp as ever. The mystery she'd carried since age 15 was finally unraveling, though not in any way she'd expected. One more thing, Vance said, reaching for a folder of lab results. The spectrographic analysis of those anomalous metal samples. The alloy composition. It doesn't match anything in our materials database. Not just from the 1940s, I mean anything, ever. The molecular structure itself is... He trailed off, struggling to find words. Is what? June pressed. Wrong, he finished simply, as if it was manufactured using techniques that don't exist. June thought of Harold's plane, still partially buried in the Olympic forest, of radar traces showing impossible climbs, of a brother who vanished into clear skies and somehow landed his aircraft decades later. Document everything, she told Vance. Photograph, measure, record, before they try to bury this again. He nodded grimly. I'll have copies of all data sent to secure locations. Whatever this is, Mrs. Mercer, they won't be able to hide it this time. June shouldered her satchel, its weight familiar after so many years of carrying Harold's story. The lab's fluorescent lights flickered, and for a moment she caught her reflection in a darkened monitor. An old woman surrounded by pieces of a mystery that had consumed her life. But now, finally, the truth was emerging. Not just about Harold's disappearance, but about something much larger. Something the military had kept hidden for 60 years. I'll be back tomorrow, she told Vance. We need to review every inch of that wreckage before they take it away. He was already turning back to his examination, ruler in hand. I'll keep at it. There's something here, Mrs. Mercer, something important. June paused at the lab door, looking back at the scattered pieces of her brother's plane. The metal gleamed under the harsh lights, holding its impossible secrets. But secrets, she had learned, couldn't stay buried forever. Not when someone was determined to dig them up. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards of June's childhood home in Forks. The house had aged like everything else. its white paint now gray and peeling, the porch steps groaning under her careful steps. But the key still worked. Her parents had never changed the locks, even after moving away. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of amber light. The furniture remained draped in old sheets, ghostly shapes in the dimness. June hadn't been here in 15 years, not since her parents passed and left her the property. She'd kept it maintained through a local service but couldn't bring herself to sell it. Now she understood why. "Second floor?" she muttered, gripping the banister. Her knees protested each step, but determination drove her upward. Harold's room was at the end of the hall, exactly as they'd left it in 1944. Their parents had never had the heart to clear it out. The door stuck slightly, swollen with decades of moisture from the Olympic Peninsula's endless rains. June pushed it open with her shoulder, and the smell of old paper and cedar washed over her. Harold's model airplane still hung from the ceiling on fishing line, their shadows wheeling slowly in the disturbed air, right where you left. "Them, big brother," she whispered. The afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, illuminating the faded aviation posters on the walls. Charles Lindbergh's stern face gazed down at her from one, the spirit of St. Louis gleaming behind him. June moved carefully through the room, touching nothing yet, letting memories surface. There, the bookshelf where Harold had kept his flight manuals and aviation magazines. The desk where he'd studied for his pilot's exams, and most importantly, the old sea chest at the foot of his bed where he'd stored his maps and personal effects. June knelt beside the chest, her joints complaining. The brass latches were dulled with age but unrusted. Good Washington cedar had protected the contents all these years. She lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of old paper and leather grew stronger. "Let's see what you were up to," she murmured. The chest contained exactly what she remembered: Harold's civilian flying logs, his early training materials, and dozens of carefully folded maps. But she wasn't interested in the official documentation. Harold had always kept his personal notes separate, hidden away. June ran her fingers along the chest's inner edges until she found it, the loose panel in the sidewall. A gentle push revealed the hidden compartment behind. Her brother's secret cache was still there, untouched for 60 years. She pulled out a leather portfolio, its surface cracked with age. Inside were Harold's private papers, letters he'd never sent, journal entries separate from his official pilot's log, and most importantly, his personal maps. June cleared space on the floor, laying out each document carefully. Most were standard military navigation charts of the Olympic Peninsula, marked with Harold's precise annotations. Flight paths, fuel calculations, terrain notes, typical pilot's documentation. But behind the last map, tucked away almost as an afterthought, she found something different. This map was hand-drawn on heavy drafting paper, the kind Harold had used for his engineering studies. The basic geography was accurate. She recognized the distinctive coastline of the peninsula, the major peaks of the Olympic range. But overlaid on the terrain were patterns she'd never seen before. Spiraling lines in red ink, intersecting at marked points. Dozens of small X's dotted the landscape, each labeled with dates and times. "What were you tracking?" June wondered aloud, squinting at the faded notations. She pulled out her phone, opening the photos she'd taken of the 2004 crash site location. The coordinates matched one of Harold's red X's exactly. Her hands began to tremble. From her satchel, she retrieved a modern topographical map of the region. Carefully using the window light, she overlaid Harold's drawing on top. The spiraling patterns aligned with features she recognized, places known for strange phenomena. The radio dead zone near Lake Crescent, the area where compasses allegedly went. Haywire, sites where hikers reported lost time and bizarre lights. June's heart pounded. All these years she'd assumed Harold had simply been on a training flight, but this map suggested something else entirely. He'd been methodically investigating something in these mountains, something he'd never told anyone about. She dug deeper into the portfolio, finding loose pages of Harold's private notes. Most were weather observations and coordinates, but one caught her eye. A newspaper clipping from 1943 about strange lights seen over the Olympics. Harold had underlined key phrases and added his own notes in the margins. Matches pattern, regular intervals, not northern lights. More papers revealed a pattern of research. Harold had been tracking reports of unusual phenomena in the region for months before his disappearance. The red spirals on his map weren't random. They followed what he called convergence points, where multiple sightings overlapped. June pulled out her laptop, connecting to the cabin's weak Wi-Fi signal. She opened the files Dr. Vance had sent her. Geological survey data showing electromagnetic anomalies in the Olympic range. Her hands shook as she compared them to Harold's map. The patterns matched. 60 years before anyone had the technology to detect them, Harold had somehow mapped the electromagnetic disturbances through simple observation and meticulous note-taking. A loose sheet fell from the portfolio, a page torn from Harold's personal journal. The entry was dated 3 days before his disappearance. Third attempt failed. Signal stronger but still can't maintain contact. Need to try higher altitude, maybe dawn when the air is clearer. Whatever's up there, it's trying to communicate. The lights aren't random. There's a pattern, a purpose. Next attempt, Friday. Weather should be perfect. June sat back, her mind racing. The official story had always been that Harold vanished in a storm, but the recently discovered weather report proved that was a lie. And now this. Evidence that his flight had been deliberate, planned, part of some private investigation he'd kept hidden from everyone. She spread the maps out again, tracing the red spirals with her finger. The pattern centered on a remote area of the Olympics, far from any trails or roads. But one feature stood out, an old fire lookout tower marked with a bold X, the same area where hikers occasionally reported strange lights and missing time. "You found something up there," June whispered, "something they didn't want anyone to know about." She carefully photographed each document, making sure to capture every detail. Then she repacked the portfolio, returning it to its hidden compartment. The sun was setting now, casting deep shadows across Harold's childhood room. June stood slowly, her knees cracking. She took one last look around the preserved space. The model plane still spinning gently. Charles Lindbergh's steady gaze. The lingering scent of cedar and old paper. Then she pulled Harold's map from her satchel one more time, studying the intricate patterns he'd drawn so long ago. "He was looking for something," she whispered to herself. The FedEx package arrived at June's motel room on a gray Tuesday morning. Inside was a clear evidence bag containing a set of scratched dog tags, along with a handwritten note. "Found these while hiking near Lake Crescent last weekend. Saw the news about the P-38. Thought you should have these. Mark Davidson." June's hands trembled as she lifted the chain. The tags were military issue, stamped with familiar information. Mercer Harold J. 0778342 T4243, a POS Catholic. She sank onto the bed, memories flooding back. Harold had worn these every day, even on leave. She remembered the way they'd clinked softly when he hugged her goodbye that last morning. A knock at the door made her jump. Dr. Caleb Vance stood outside looking apologetic. "Sorry I'm late," he said, stepping in from the rain. "Traffic from Seattle was—" He trailed off when he saw what she was holding. "Are those—" "Just came in the mail," June said. "A hiker found them near the crash site." Vance put down his briefcase and pulled out latex gloves. "May I?" June handed him the tags. He examined them under a pocket loop, frowning. "These look unusually well preserved for being out in the elements for 60 years, he said. "What do you mean?" "The stamping is crisp, minimal corrosion." He pulled out his phone. "I know someone at the University of Washington Materials Lab. We should get these tested." June nodded. More pieces that didn't fit the official story. 3 days later, Vance's contact called with preliminary results. June put the phone on speaker as they sat in her motel room. "The metal composition is definitely military-issue dog tag alloy," the scientist said, "but it's not from the 1940s. The manufacturing process and trace elements are consistent with tags produced around 2001. Silence filled the room. June stared at Vance, who looked equally stunned. "That's impossible," June finally said. "These have my brother's information, his service number." "The information is authentic World War II data," the scientist agreed. "But these tags were made long after that. Someone produced these tags using Harold's original information, but they did it in 2001. After hanging up, June paced the small room while Vance reviewed his notes. "This matches other anomalies," he said. The wreckage showed inconsistent aging patterns. Now these modern dog tags with period-accurate information. It's like we're dealing with two different timelines. "Or someone's playing an elaborate hoax," June said sharply. "Who would go to this much trouble, and why?" Before June could answer, her cell phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Hello?" No response, just static and what sounded like distant wind. "Hello? Who is this?" The call ended. A voicemail notification appeared. June's fingers shook as she accessed her voicemail. Through bursts of static, a man's voice spoke. "I saw your brother. He wasn't alone." The message ended. June immediately tried calling back, but a recorded message stated the number was no longer in service. "Play it again," Vance said. They listened 3 more times. The voice was male, older, with a slight Pacific Northwest accent. Behind his words was a strange rushing sound, like wind through trees. "Can you clean this up?" June asked. "Filter out the static? I know someone who can try, but June—" Vance hesitated. "Are you sure you want to keep pulling this thread? First the modern dog tags, now this call. Someone might be trying to manipulate you. Or someone might finally be telling the truth," she countered. That evening, June sat alone in her room, spreading out her evidence: Harold's maps, the forensic reports, photos of the crash site, and now these impossible dog tags. She'd been staring at them for hours when someone slipped an envelope under her door. Her heart racing, June approached carefully. It was a standard manila envelope, no markings or return address. Inside was a single photograph. The image was grainy, likely taken with a telephoto lens. It showed the P-38 in flight, banking through clouds. The angle captured the cockpit clearly enough to see a figure inside, wearing what appeared to be a World War II flight helmet. June grabbed her magnifying glass. The photo was dated in the corner, October 12, 2004, the day of Walter Griggs's sighting. She studied the pilot's silhouette. The helmet and oxygen mask obscured their face, but the posture was familiar. She'd seen Harold sit that same way in countless photographs, leaning slightly left, head tilted as he scanned the horizon. Her phone rang again. Unknown number. This time when she answered, there was only the sound of propellers cutting through air, growing fainter and fainter until the line went dead. June looked back at the photo, at the figure in the cockpit who couldn't possibly be her brother, yet wore his helmet, flew his plane, matched his posture exactly. The man on the phone had said Harold wasn't alone. What did that mean? Who else had been up there with him, either in 1944 or 2004 or both? She reached for the dog tags again, running her fingers over the pristine stamping. Tags from 2001 that matched her brother's 1944 information perfectly. A plane that showed up 60 years after it vanished. A pilot who looked exactly like Harold. The pieces were there, but they formed an impossible picture. June had spent decades looking for answers about her brother's disappearance. Now that they were finally coming, she wasn't sure she was ready for what they might reveal. She pinned the photo to her evidence board next to Harold's original military portrait. In both images, the same aircraft, the same helmet, the same distinctive way of holding the controls. 60 years apart, yet somehow connected. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Check. The back of the photo. Unknown number again. With trembling fingers, June turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink was a single line. Some clouds don't move with the wind. The abandoned fire lookout tower rose like a skeletal finger against the October sky. June Mercer and Dr. Caleb Vance stood at its base, studying the rusted metal framework that climbed 80 feet into the clouds. The structure hadn't appeared on any Forest Service maps since 1962. "This matches the coordinates from the radar signature," Vance said, checking his handheld GPS unit. He squinted up at the observation cabin. "But I don't understand. Fire towers don't have radar equipment." June pulled a faded photograph from her satchel, a 1944 aerial survey showing this same peak. "Look here," she said, pointing to a detail near the tower. "That circular platform wasn't standard Forest Service design." Vance adjusted his glasses. "Could be an antenna array, but for what?" The climb up the metal stairs took nearly 20 minutes. Each step groaned under their weight, decades of rust flaking away beneath their boots. The Olympic Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, peaks wrapped in mist like islands in a gray sea. The observation cabin was larger than standard fire towers. A 20-foot square platform with windows on all sides. The door's padlock had long since rusted through. Inside, dust coated everything in layers thick enough to obscure the floor's metal plating. "This isn't a fire tower," Vance said immediately. "Look at the equipment." Banks of old monitoring devices lined the walls. Their displays were dark, but June recognized military-grade radar screens and radio equipment. A large plotting table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered by a yellowed tactical map of the Olympic Peninsula airspace. "Help me clear this off," June said, brushing away decades of dust. The map beneath was marked with hundreds of intersecting lines and annotations. dates ranging from 1944 to 1982. Many entries were circled in red, with arrows pointing to handwritten notes in the margins. Echo phenomenon observed 2300 hours. No radar return. Visual confirmation only. Vance read aloud. These are observation logs. June moved to a bank of filing cabinets against the far wall. The metal drawers stuck at first, then scraped open with protest. Inside, hundreds of manila folders were organized by date. "Look at this," she said, pulling out a thick file labeled 1944-45 incidents. Inside were typewritten reports and black and white photographs of radar screens. One report was dated the day Harold disappeared. 0945 hours. Target Echo detected at 12,000 feet, bearing 270. No flight plan filed. Contact lost at 0952 hours following rapid vertical acceleration. Note, similar signature to Echo 7 event. Vance was examining a different cabinet. These files go up through the early 2000s. Whatever they were tracking here, they watched it for decades. June spread photographs across the plotting table. They showed the same distinctive radar signature, a straight flight path suddenly ending in a vertical spike, repeated across different years, 1944, 1958, 1972, 1989, 2004. "The same pattern," she whispered, "over and over." A logbook from 1972 caught her attention. The entry was written in hurried handwriting. October 15th. H-237 returned. No approach vector. Departure observed. Note, aircraft condition unchanged from previous sighting. Recommend Protocol 7A. H-237, Vance read over her shoulder. "That's Harold's plane," June finished. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. They knew. All this time, they were watching for him to come back. Vance had moved to a shelf of technical manuals. "This goes deeper than just observation. Look, these are classified documents about something called Project Echo Flight, testing atmospheric electromagnetic anomalies and their effects on aircraft navigation." Was Harold part of these tests? Not officially, but according to this, there were multiple incidents of planes encountering unusual phenomena in this region. Most were explained away as pilot error or weather conditions, but some... He trailed off, reading intently. June continued searching through the observation logs. The entries grew more detailed through the 1960s and 70s, with precise measurements of altitude, speed, and electromagnetic readings. Many mentioned temporal discontinuity and echo signatures. A metal storage trunk beneath the plotting table yielded more secrets. Boxes of photographs showing strange lights in the sky, blurry images of aircraft in impossible positions, and page after page of witness statements from pilots who reported losing time during flights over the Olympics. "June!" Vance called from across the room. He stood before a small locker, its door hanging open. "You need to see this." Inside the locker was a leather flight jacket, its collar stained with age. The name patch read Lieutenant H. Mercer. June touched the leather with trembling fingers. "This isn't the one we found in the plane. This is different." Beneath the jacket lay a small leather-bound journal. The cover was weathered but intact. June opened it carefully. The first page bore a familiar signature, H.M., but the date below it read March 15th, 1974. The handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, the same precise, slanted script she remembered from his letters home. June sank into a dusty chair, her legs suddenly weak. "That's impossible," Vance said. "He disappeared in 44. June began reading aloud. Day 847 in the loop. The clouds don't move like they should. They watch and wait. I've tried different headings, different altitudes, but they always find me. Today I saw another plane, one of ours, a P-51. The pilot waved. When I blinked, he was gone. They're all gone. Only the watchers remain." She turned page after page. The entries described a nightmare of endless flight. Strange lights, distorted time, and the constant presence of something watching from within the clouds. Harold wrote about seeing other aircraft from different eras, about radio signals that played backwards, about the sky itself seeming to fold and twist around him. "Look at this," Vance said, pointing to a technical note in the margin. "He's recording specific coordinates and temporal markers. These aren't the ravings of a lost man. He was methodically documenting what he experienced." June could barely breathe as she read her brother's words. He was alive in 1974. Somehow he was still flying. The final entry was dated November 2nd, 1974. The corridor is opening again. I can feel it in the static, in the way the compass spins. Maybe this time I'll find my way back. If not, I've left these notes for June. Keep watching the clouds, little sister. Not all of them are what they seem. The rest of the pages were blank. Vance was examining the observation logs from the same period. There's a gap in the official records for that entire week in November 74. But look at this weather note. Unusual electromagnetic activity observed. Similar to 44 event. June carefully placed the journal in her satchel. We need to document everything here before... A deep rumble shook the tower. They rushed to the windows. Dark clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, swirling around the peak like water down a drain. The old equipment in the tower suddenly hummed to life, dials spinning, screens flickering with ghostly images. Through the clouds, a familiar sound echoed across the mountains, the distant drone of Allison engines. The tower's equipment continued its eerie hum as June and Vance spread Harold's 1974 journal across the plotting table. Outside, the dark clouds churned, but the distant engine sounds had faded. Look at this, June said, carefully turning pages filled with Harold's precise handwriting. Each entry was meticulously dated, though the dates themselves made no linear sense, jumping between months and seasons within the same week. April 12, 1974. Third attempt to map the corridor failed. Standard instruments useless when approaching the phenomenon. Magnetic compass spins wildly. Radio only picks up fragments of broadcasts. Some sound like old war reports, others haven't happened yet. Vance leaned closer, squinting at a detailed sketch spanning 2 pages. The drawing showed a distinctive lens-shaped cloud formation, with careful annotations marking wind directions and atmospheric pressure readings. That's a lenticular cloud, he said, pointing to the sketch. They're common in the Cascades, form when stable, moist air flows over mountains. But these notes... He traced Harold's cramped writing along the margins. He's describing something inside them. June read aloud. The lenticulars aren't natural formations. They maintain position regardless of wind conditions. Something generates them from within. When approached at bearing 270, cloud mass exhibits unusual properties. Selective solidity, electromagnetic interference, possible gateway configuration. She turned to another page where Harold had drawn a complex diagram of intersecting flight paths, each line connected to a central point marked simply as corridor. The margins were filled with calculations, angles, speeds, timestamps. May 3, 1974. Latest attempt confirms previous observations. Corridor appears at specific coordinates when conditions align. Entering requires precise speed and angle. Too slow. Nothing happens. Too fast. Violent turbulence forces retreat. But at exactly 342 Mohrar, approaching from 270 degrees, reality shifts. Time becomes fluid. Other aircraft appear and vanish. The watches stop working. Vance pulled out his phone, checking coordinates against modern maps. These flight paths, they all intersect over a specific section of the Olympic range, right where that P-38 was spotted in 2004. June's hands trembled as she turned to a series of increasingly desperate entries. June 15, 1974. They're aware of me now, the Watchers. I see their shadows in the corridor, moving against natural law. They study my attempts to map their domain. Each pass through the gateway becomes harder. They're learning. June 16, 1974. Lost another day. Or gained one. Instruments contradictory. Spotted a commercial airliner during last corridor transit. Wrong markings, unknown airline. When I radioed, they responded with a flight number that doesn't exist yet. June 17, 1974. The corridor is more than a gateway. It's a loop. Each transit brings me back to the same point in space, but different points in time. I've seen my own contrails, crossed my own path, trying to document each iteration, but memory becomes unreliable inside the phenomenon. The journal's middle section contained detailed atmospheric readings, wind patterns, and astronomical observations. Harold had meticulously recorded every detail about the corridor, approaching it like the test pilot he was trained to be. But as the entries progressed, his scientific tone gave way to mounting unease. July 24, 1974. They're hurting me now. Each attempt to break free of the loop is countered. The clouds shift position, blocking escape vectors. Other aircraft appear as warnings or lures. P-51s, B-17s, planes I don't recognize. Some vanish if approached. Others, better not to approach. August 9, 1974. Found another pilot trapped in the corridor today. Brief radio contact before he vanished. Said he was from 1983. Asked if the war was over. Which war? Signal faded before I could ask. The next pages were filled with sketches, cross-sections of cloud formations, diagrams of electromagnetic fields, and one particularly detailed drawing of what Harold labeled Watcher Manifestation. The image showed a dark, twisting shape within the clouds, its form suggesting movement while remaining maddeningly unclear. September 30th. September 1974. The P-38 feels wrong. Metal aged decades between corridor transits, then reversed. Instruments record impossible readings. Fuel gauge hasn't moved since June, or was it August? Time blurs here. Only the watchers remain constant. Vance was comparing Harold's sketches to weather maps on his laptop. These lenticular cloud formations he documented, they're still reported in the same locations today. Pilots avoid them due to extreme turbulence. June found a loose page tucked into the journal's back cover. It was a letter, never sent. Dear June, if you find this, I'm sorry for disappearing. The experiment wasn't supposed to go this way. We were testing new navigation systems, studying anomalies in the Olympic range. The brass didn't tell us everything. Now I'm trapped in their corridor, watching time fold back on itself. The watchers won't let me land, won't let me crash. Just endless flight through skies that shouldn't exist. I see forks sometimes, through gaps in the clouds, but it's never the right year. Once I saw our house being built. Another time, it was gone completely. I'm trying to find my way back to 1944, but the corridor has its own rules. The watchers have their own purpose. Keep this journal safe. Others need to know what's up here, hidden in the clouds that don't move. The letter ended there, unsigned. June sat heavily in a dusty chair, clutching the journal. He was alive in 1974, actually alive, writing these entries, but how? Her phone buzzed. A text from Matt Connolly, the forensics investigator. DNA results confirmed. Mummified remains from Olympic cave system match Harold Mercer. Date of death estimated 1944 to 1945. She showed the message to Vance, who frowned. That's impossible. These journal entries are definitely Harold's handwriting, June finished. I'd know it anywhere. And that 2004 sighting, the pilot in the cockpit. She flipped to the journal's final pages, where Harold's neat script had become increasingly erratic. October 12, 1974. The corridor is decaying, each transit more unstable than the last. Reality fractures at the edges. Saw myself flying yesterday. Another Harold in another P-38. He didn't wave back. The watchers are closing their door. October 29, 1974. Time compression increasing. Years pass between heartbeats in the corridor now. The P-38's metal remembers all of them. I found a newspaper scrap caught in the tail section, dated 2004. How long have I been flying? Final entry. November 2nd, 1974. The watchers are changing the rules. The corridor pulls in too many directions now. I can feel time splintering around the aircraft. If anyone finds this journal, the answers aren't in the clouds. They never were. The clouds are just windows. The real mystery is what looks back through them. The next corridor opens soon. One last attempt to break free. If I don't make it, remember, not all versions of us end where they're supposed to. Some keep flying. Some are still trying to land. The remaining pages were blank, except for a final sketch. A perfect rendering of the P-38 Lightning that witnesses would spot 30 years later, in 2004, slicing through the Olympic mist with impossible grace. June carefully closed the journal, her mind struggling with irreconcilable facts. Her brother's DNA confirmed remains from 1944, his detailed writings from 1974, and a sighting in 2004 that matched his flight path exactly. The man in that cockpit, glimpsed by dozens of witnesses, had worn a World War II flight suit and helmet, just like Harold. The corridor, she whispered. It didn't just trap him in the clouds, it trapped him in time. Vance was staring at the old monitoring equipment, now silent again. Whatever he encountered up there, whatever these watchers were, they left evidence. 30 years of documented sightings, radar logs, multiple witnesses. He tapped the journal. And this. June's phone buzzed again. Another message from Connolly. Found something else in the cave. Second set of dog tags. Same name, same serial number. Metal dates to 1974. She looked up at Vance, her voice steady despite the impossible weight of understanding. My brother died in 1944, and in 1974, and maybe he's still up there, trying to find his way home through clouds that don't follow the rules of time. Through the tower's windows, the dark clouds continued their unnatural swirl around the mountain peak. Somewhere in that aerial maze of electromagnetic anomalies and temporal corridors, a P-38 Lightning with the tail number H-237 had vanished into history, not once but many times, carrying the same pilot through decades of impossible flight. The truth was in Harold's careful notes, his precise diagrams, his increasingly desperate observations. Not all mysteries could be solved with simple answers. Some, like the clouds that didn't move, defied explanation. They could only be documented, witnessed, and remembered by those left behind to watch the skies. The military convoy appeared before dawn. June watched from her motel window as olive-drab trucks rolled through Forks's empty streets, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. National Guard Humvees and unmarked black SUVs followed, carrying stern-faced men in civilian clothes who flashed credentials at local police. By sunrise, they had cordoned off 5 square miles around the crash site. Orange barriers and restricted area signs sprouted along forest roads. Armed personnel established checkpoints. Helicopters thundered overhead, carrying heavy equipment deeper into the Olympic wilderness. "This is completely illegal," Dr. Vance muttered, pacing their small room at the Dewdrop Inn. "That wreck is a historical artifact, not government property." June sat at the rickety desk, spreading out copies of Harold's journal entries and photographs. They knew. All these years they knew about the corridor. Her voice was tight with 6 decades of accumulated anger. They watched pilots vanish and said nothing. Her phone buzzed. Matt Connolly calling. She put him on speaker. "They're removing everything," he reported, slightly out of breath. "I'm watching from Ridge Trail with binoculars. They've got some kind of specialized lifting equipment. The entire P-38 is being disassembled and crated." "Are they preserving the evidence?" Vance demanded. "They're being careful, I'll give them that, but systematic. Cataloging every piece before it goes into sealed containers. Even taking soil samples." A pause. "Wait, someone's coming. I'll call back." The line went dead. June stared at the papers covering the desk. 60 years of research, witness accounts, weather anomalies, radar records, Harold's journal entries describing impossible things, the DNA results proving he died in 1944 while his 1974 writings sat in her hands, all of it pointing to something beyond normal explanation. "They can't bury this again," she said quietly. "Not this time." She opened her laptop and began typing. For the next 6 hours, she worked steadily, organizing decades of evidence into a coherent narrative. She included scans of Harold's journal entries, official documents, weather maps, radar logs, and photographs. The 2004 sightings, the forensic contradictions, the fire tower records. When she finished, she had a 40-page PDF titled "The Crescent Echo, The True Story of Harold Mercer and the Olympic Peninsula Time Corridor." "Are you sure about this?" Vance asked as she prepared to hit send. "Once it's out there." "I'm done waiting for answers," June replied. She pressed the button. The document went to newspapers, TV stations, aviation historians, and military watchdog groups. She posted it on aviation forums and social media. Within hours, it began spreading. By nightfall, her phone was ringing constantly. Reporters, researchers, UFO enthusiasts, government spokespeople issuing carefully worded denials. June ignored them all, watching the story take on a life of its own. Mysterious WW2 fighter found in Olympic forest. Vanished pilot's sister reveals decades-long cover-up time travel experiments in Washington state. "Ms. Mercer?" A sharp knock at the door. 2 men in dark suits stood outside, holding up badges. "We need to speak with you about classified material you may have accessed." June didn't open the door. "Everything I released came from public records and personal research. You can't classify my brother's journal." "Ma'am, we need you to come with us to discuss national security concerns. I'll meet you tomorrow at the Port Angeles Federal Building, with my lawyer present." They tried to argue, but June held firm. After they left, Vance helped her move to a different motel, using cash and a false name. That night, her encrypted email pinged, an anonymous message containing only a link to a private server. When she clicked it, a video player opened. The footage was grainy black and white, dated August 15, 1946. The label read Crescent Echo Test Flight 7. It showed a military airfield, old wooden hangars, canvas windmills marking the runway. A P-38 Lightning sat ready for takeoff, its twin booms gleaming in the sun. The tail number was clearly visible, H237. June's hands trembled as she pressed play. The camera followed the aircraft's takeoff roll, its smooth climb into scattered clouds. Other angles showed radar screens, weather instruments, men in lab coats taking notes. At the 4-minute mark, something changed. The clouds around the P-38 began moving strangely, swirling, compressing. The aircraft's metal seemed to ripple, like heat waves off hot pavement. Then, in a blink, it vanished. The camera kept rolling, showing empty sky and increasingly agitated ground personnel. A final shot, time-stamped 3 hours later. The same patch of sky, now filled with roiling clouds that moved against the wind. No aircraft emerged. The film ended. June played it again, and again. She froze frames, studying every detail. The pilot's posture in the cockpit, the way the clouds behaved, the strange distortion effect just before the vanishing. It's not Harold flying, she realized. This was 2 years after he disappeared. They were trying to reproduce what happened to him. Her phone buzzed. Matt Connolly again. June, you need to see this. The whole internet is exploding. People are digging up old reports, photos, radar data. It's not just Harold. There are dozens of cases. Missing pilots, weird cloud formations, time distortions, all through the Olympics going back decades. She opened her laptop. The story had gone viral. Hashtag Crescent Echo was trending. Amateur investigators were connecting dots she hadn't even seen, finding patterns in flight paths and disappearance dates. Atmospheric scientists were analyzing cloud formation data. Aviation experts were debating the P-38's capabilities. A new email arrived from a retired Air Force colonel who claimed to have worked on Project Crescent Echo in the 1960s. He attached scanned documents showing the military had mapped electromagnetic anomalies throughout the Olympic range, identifying zones where time itself seemed to behave strangely. We lost more planes, he wrote. More pilots. The brass shut it down in '74 when we couldn't control the corridor effects, but they never stopped watching. Your brother wasn't the first to vanish up there. He was just the first to leave evidence behind. June's phone kept buzzing with notifications, but she barely noticed. She was staring at the final frame of the 1946 film, where the clouds twisted into impossible shapes around the vanishing point of Harold's P-38. The truth had finally broken free, rising like mist from the Olympic forests where her brother had flown into mystery. The military could confiscate the wreckage. They could seal off the crash site, but they couldn't hide the evidence scattered across 60 years of documents, witnesses, and weather patterns. They couldn't erase Harold's voice from his recovered journals, describing a nightmare of eternal flight through skies that bent the rules of time. Somewhere in the Olympic mountains, behind ribbons of yellow tape and armed guard posts, an empty crater held the impression of where a P-38 had waited 60 years to be found. Its pilot's remains lay in a cave, while his words from 1974 sat in June's laptop, and grainy footage showed his plane vanishing in 1946. The truth of Harold Mercer's fate now lived in thousands of downloaded copies of June's document, spreading across the digital landscape like fog through mountain valleys. The story was loose in the world, gathering momentum, inspiring others to look closer at the strange skies above the Olympic Peninsula. The October wind cut through June's jacket as she parked her rental car along the unmarked Forest Service road. She'd chosen this spot carefully, just outside the newly restricted zone, but with a clear view of the ridge where Harold's P-38 had rested for 60 years. Through breaks in the evergreens, she could see the yellow tape and temporary fencing glinting in the late afternoon sun. 2 black SUVs patrolled the perimeter, their government plates catching the light. June pulled out her binoculars, noting how they moved in precise patterns, never leaving any section unwatched for more than 5 minutes. The military's presence had grown more obvious since her document went public. What had started as a few investigators had evolved into a full security operation. The air felt heavy, electrical. Dark clouds were building over the Olympic peaks, their edges sharp and unnatural against the dimming sky. June checked her watch, 5:47 p.m. Sunset would come early this deep in the mountains. She shouldered her old leather satchel, loaded with decades of maps and documents, and began the careful hike up to her chosen vantage point. Her boots knew these trails, even as age had slowed her pace. The forest was different now. Sections cordoned off, new no trespassing signs nailed to ancient trunks, but she could still find her way through the shadows of towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. A distant rumble of thunder made her pause. The storm was moving faster than expected, rolling in from the Pacific. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind picked up, bringing with it the sharp scent of ozone. June pulled her jacket tighter and pressed on. The ridge she was aiming for rose about half a mile from the crash site, high enough to see over the security perimeter, far enough to avoid detection. As she climbed, memories of other hikes flooded back, searching with her parents in those first desperate weeks. Later, solo expeditions with theodolites and compasses, trying to triangulate Harold's last known position. The countless times she'd returned, hoping to find something overlooked. Now, 60 years later, she had found something. But the truth was stranger than any theory she'd entertained in those early days of grief. June reached her destination just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. From here, she could see the whole valley where Harold's P-38 had rested, nose down in the soil. The military had erected temporary structures, white tents and portable lights. Even now, figures in protective suits moved between them, cataloging and crating pieces of the aircraft. She settled onto a fallen log, protected somewhat by a thick stand of hemlocks, and pulled out her thermal binoculars, a gift from Dr. Vance. Through them, she watched the methodical dismantling of her brother's legacy. Each piece of the P-38 was being documented, wrapped, and loaded into specialized containers. The work continued despite the approaching storm. The rain intensified. Lightning flickered between the clouds, followed by deeper rolls of thunder. The wind whipped through the trees with increasing force, and the temperature continued to drop. June's phone buzzed, a text from Matt Connolly. Hunter just called local radio station. Claims he saw something over Bear Creek. Silver aircraft, no sound. Headed your way. June's hands tightened on the binoculars. The storm was directly overhead now, the clouds roiling in strange patterns. Lightning illuminated their edges in stark relief, revealing shapes that seemed to move independent of the wind. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from an unknown number. Ranger Station 14 reporting radar contact. High altitude, moving fast. Signature matches H237. Thunder cracked so loud it made her flinch. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but June didn't move. She kept her binoculars trained on the sky, scanning methodically. The security teams below were scrambling, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom as they looked upward. Then she saw it, a glint of silver, barely visible through the clouds. The distinctive twin-boom silhouette of a P-38 Lightning, illuminated by another flash of lightning. It moved silently, too smoothly for any modern aircraft, its metal catching the storm's light in impossible ways. June fumbled with her phone, trying to record, but the aircraft was already fading into the clouds. Her hands shook as she watched it climb higher, remembering Harold's last journal entry. They're not clouds, they watch. Now she understood. The clouds weren't just watching, they were waiting, opening. The P-38 banked sharply, its outline briefly clear against the turbulent sky. The tail number was visible for just a moment. H237. Tears mixed with rain on June's cheeks as the aircraft disappeared into the heart of the storm. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant she saw the clouds twist into that same spiral pattern described in the fire tower logs. The P-38 was just a dot now, climbing at an impossible angle into the vortex. "Fly safe, Harold," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind and rain. The security teams were in chaos below, radios crackling with reports and coordinates. Flashlights swept the sky, but it was too late. The P-38 was gone, leaving only questions and the lingering light of lightning in its wake. June sat in the rain, watching the storm slowly move eastward. Her brother's voice echoed in her memory from that last morning in 1944. "Don't worry, Junebug. I always find my way home." She thought of the empty cockpit they'd found, the journal from 1974, the radar blips that kept returning decade after decade. Perhaps in some way she couldn't understand, Harold had kept that promise, not trapped in one time, but moving between them, still flying through skies that bent the rules of reality. The rain gradually eased, and the thunder moved off into the distance. June's phone was full of missed calls and messages, from Vance, from reporters, from government officials. She ignored them all, keeping her eyes on the spot where the P-38 had vanished. Below, the security teams were regrouping, their radios still chattering with confused reports. June knew they would come looking soon, sweeping the ridges for witnesses. It was time to go. She packed away her binoculars and stood slowly, her joints stiff from the cold and damp. As she began her careful descent through the darkening forest, June felt lighter somehow. The mystery that had consumed her life hadn't been solved, not really, but she had seen enough to know that Harold's story wasn't over. It was still unfolding in the skies above the Olympic Mountains, written in contrails and radar signatures, in strange clouds and silent aircraft that defied time itself. The truth was up there, flying endless circles through yesterday and tomorrow, carrying her brother through skies that never ended. And maybe that was answer enough. The morning fog clung to the streets of Forks, Washington, as June Mercer pulled her old Subaru into the small parking lot beside the town library. 1 year had passed since that stormy night on the ridge. The trunk of her car was filled with boxes, advance copies of Echoes Above the Pines, fresh from the publisher. She moved slower these days, her joints stiff in the damp Pacific Northwest autumn, but her eyes remained sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. The library's front door chimed as she entered, greeted by the familiar scent of old books and coffee from the reading room. "Morning, June," called Martha, the head librarian. They'd become friends over the past year as June had spent countless hours here, piecing together her manuscript. "Big day, isn't it?" June nodded, setting her worn leather satchel on the counter. "The first copies arrived yesterday. I wanted you to have one before the official release." She pulled out a hardbound book, its dust jacket showing a black and white photograph of a P-38 Lightning silhouetted against storm clouds. Below it, in stark letters, "Echoes Above the Pines, the disappearance of Harold Mercer and the mystery of Flight H-237. Martha ran her fingers over the embossed title. "It's beautiful, June. Will you sign it?" As June wrote an inscription, she caught her reflection in the library window. 77 years old now, silver hair pulled back in her usual braid. But the determined set of her jaw hadn't changed since she was that 15-year-old girl, refusing to believe her brother was truly gone. The book had taken shape during sleepless nights and long days, fueled by decades of research and that final year of revelations. She'd included everything she could: Harold's original flight logs, the weather anomalies, the fire tower records, the 2004 sighting, and the cave discovery. Even the parts the government had tried to redact were there, though carefully worded to avoid legal issues. Dr. Vance had helped with the technical sections, explaining the atmospheric conditions that could create temporal anomalies. Matt Connolly had contributed a chapter on the military's secret high-altitude testing program. But the heart of the book was Harold's own words, both from his 1944 journal and the mysterious 1974 entries found in the fire tower. June spent the morning arranging a small display in the library's local history section. Copies of old newspapers, photographs, maps marked with flight paths and radar signatures. A timeline stretched across one wall, connecting dots that spanned 60 years. At noon, she drove to the Forks Timber Museum where they'd installed a new memorial. The fog had lifted, revealing patches of blue sky between the clouds. Tourist season was over, leaving the parking lot nearly empty. The monument stood in a small garden beside the museum. A bronze P-38 Lightning mounted on a granite base, its nose pointed skyward. The plaque read, "Lieutenant Harold Mercer, 1920-1944. The boy the mountain kept," and below that, "Some mysteries transcend time itself." June parked and retrieved something from her satchel. Harold's flight badge, preserved in its original leather case. She'd found it among their mother's things after she passed, kept safe all those years. The metal still caught the light, the eagle's wings spread wide, Harold's name and service number clear beneath the patina of age. As she walked toward the monument, memories surfaced like old photographs. Harold teaching her to ride his motorcycle, his hands steady on the handlebars. The smell of engine oil in their father's garage as Harold worked on the Indian chief he'd bought with his first military paycheck. The sound of his laughter echoing through their childhood home. The grass was wet with morning dew as June knelt at the base of the monument. She opened the leather case, touching the badge one last time. In her book's final chapter, she'd written about choice and circumstance, about how some questions might never have clear answers, how perhaps the truth wasn't always meant to be captured and cataloged, but simply witnessed and wondered at. She placed the badge carefully against the granite base, securing it with a small piece of blue ribbon, the same shade as the summer sky Harold had loved to fly through. Standing took effort now, her knees protesting the damp ground, but she managed, brushing grass from her slacks as she stepped back to study the memorial. The bronze P-38 gleamed despite the overcast day, its lines capturing the sleek power of the real aircraft. A cool breeze stirred the trees bordering the museum grounds. June closed her eyes, listening to the wind in the pines. She'd done what she set out to do, preserved Harold's story, documented the inexplicable events, and challenged the official narrative of a simple training accident. The breeze strengthened, carrying with it the sharp scent of approaching rain. June gathered her satchel, ready to head home. She had interviews scheduled for the next few weeks, book signings to arrange, and more copies to distribute to key people who'd helped with her research. As she turned toward her car, something made her pause. A sound, faint but distinct, drifted down from the clouds. A steady thrumming that anyone who'd grown up around airfields would recognize, the rhythm of twin propellers cutting through mist. June didn't look up. She didn't need to. The sound faded slowly, not like a plane moving away, but like an echo dissolving into memory. A smile touched her lips as she walked to her car, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. Harold's badge caught the weak sunlight behind her, the eagle's wings gleaming against dark granite. Above, the clouds continued their eternal dance over the Olympic mountains, keeping their secrets close, while somewhere in those mysterious skies, a silver P-38 flew on through eternal twilight, its pilot forever young, forever searching for the way home. The truth of what happened to Harold Mercer might never be fully known. The government files might stay sealed, the radar anomalies unexplained, the strange weather patterns unresolved. But June had done what mattered most. She'd kept his memory alive, transformed local legend into documented history, and opened the door for others to wonder at the mysteries that lived in the spaces between what we know and what we believe. In the end, Harold hadn't disappeared. He'd become something else, a story that would be told and retold, a mystery that would spark imagination and debate, a reminder that some questions were worth a lifetime of seeking, even if the answers remained just out of reach. The first drops of rain began to fall as June drove away from the museum. Her book rested on the passenger seat, Harold's face smiling from the back cover photo, forever 24, forever about to climb into his P-38 for that final training flight. But now his story would live on, echoing through the years like the sound of phantom propellers in the mist, reminding future generations that sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't the ones we solve, but the ones that teach us to keep looking up at the sky and wonder.